I identify as queer.
I'm bisexual. I am a lesbian and non-binary.
Pansexual male.
I'm pansexual and transgender.
Gender non-conforming, basically. Why limit yourself? As long as they're pretty and make me laugh, I would love to date them.
So is this the Greek god of love? Well, going back to the 18th century, according to the whores, that is the statue of Eros. At the age of 16, when I left the nest, so to speak, if Eros with his bow and arrow cast a shot at a gay man, I'd be a happy man. Now, of course, we've got LGBTQI+. And to be honest with you, being a gay man, I should understand it, but I don't. My personal history as a gay man also really began here. I gravitated to here. One of the reasons I gravitated to here was because this area was known as the meat rack. And the meat rack was where you could get sex with a boy if you were a man. And so I came here basically to make money. So this was in the 1970s, and homosexuality was only partially decriminalised in 1967. This year, over 1 million people attended Gay Pride, and of course the big corporations pump lots of money in. But the first Pride was in 1972. It was a political event. Bottles would be thrown at the marchers. And if you think about all those big corporations that sell their product around the world, where today homosexuality is still illegal. 1968 was the year when the civil rights movement gained ground, and it laid the foundations for lesbians and gays to organise. And the Gay Liberation Front was born here at the London School of Economics.
Well, I was a student at LSE in 1969, and I was going down the corridor and I saw a poster on the wall which said first meeting of the Gay Liberation Front. And I had only just learnt the word gay. I thought, oh, that means homosexual. That's me. But I thought, I definitely want to go to that. So I went to the first meeting of the UK Gay Liberation Front at LSE, and which was set up by Aubrey Walter and Bob Mellors, 2 gay men. And there were 20 of us there at that first meeting, 19 men and me. So they wanted to be inclusive. They didn't use that word in those days, but they wanted to be men and women. So they immediately put me on the steering committee, which was a bit silly because I was 19 and I had no background in political science at all. I was studying mathematics. So we arranged our first larger meeting, 100 people at the second meeting, and then there were 5 women there, including the late Mary McIntosh. And it was very much a gay male organisation, and that really was brought home to me when one of the men said, we could invite Women's Lib to come along. And there was a bit of a laugh at that, and someone said, yes, they can bring sandwiches and coffee. And that has remained in my mind ever since, as there was always going to be a tension between gay men and lesbians. But we did have our first march in November, Highbury Fields, and I was the spokesperson at that march. And I said, and you can find the article in the Times from that period, it's important to know that we're not ashamed to be homosexual.
I got involved in the newly formed Gay Liberation Front in 1971 when I was 19. At that time, this was the first major movement where there was a mass coming out of LGBT plus people, and we staged the first ever protests challenging the police, the government, the church, the psychiatric and medical professions, and the media to try and get a better deal for LGBT plus people. The Gay Liberation Front was never just about legal equality. We saw that as a stepping stone to a wider, broader transformation of society. We were revolutionaries. We wanted to change society, but also for women, black and ethnic minority peoples, working class people, and many others. We saw ourselves as part of a much bigger, broader movement for social change.
And then the 80s came with the spectre of AIDS. And in 1988, the Thatcher government passed the infamous Clause 28 bill. Stonewall was formed as a response to it.
The interesting thing about Stonewall is that it came at the end of the 80s. So the 80s was an interesting time for lesbians and gays in the UK because the first person to die of AIDS died at the beginning of the 80s, and then towards the end of the 80s, there was this thing called Section 28, which was, peculiar phrasing, was the prohibition of the promotion of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. So during the 80s, there was a kind of resistance, I suppose you could call it, from what became known as the loony left boroughs. So what it was really about was about using us, lesbians and gays, as a handy tool to beat up the left-wing local authorities. What I think was interesting was our response to it. None of the advances on homosexual law reform in Britain have ever been made by asking people to take a view about homosexuality, because you lose. So we made it a free speech issue. So what we said was, if you pass this law, no Michelangelo taught in schools, no Leonardo taught in schools. And actually that turned out to be a way of building a very broad coalition. If you look at what happened from 1989 through to 2014, which was really the successful completion of taking every single discriminatory bit of legislation off the books. And that was a remarkable achievement, built, as I say, around these big alliances, so getting the support of the general public, because it means that people who don't necessarily approve of homosexuality nonetheless also don't approve of people being discriminated against under the law.
So at the beginning, it was lesbian, gay, and bisexual. And then in the 90s, we get the T, and the T stands for transgender. So now, it's all under one big umbrella.
The Gay Liberation Front newspaper, come together in the early 1970s, published articles by trans advocates. And indeed, trans people within the Gay Liberation Front wrote their own manifesto. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual people share with trans people a similar experience of prejudice, discrimination, and hate crime. Moreover, we are all gender nonconformists. By our sexual orientation, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people don't conform to traditional gender expectations. We have sex with and love people of the same sex. Equally, trans people don't conform to the traditional gender expectations of people possessing certain biological characteristics. So we're all sexual and gender dissidents.
So this doesn't mean that trans people weren't involved in the struggle for gay liberation from the very start, but Stonewall and other organisations began advocating for trans rights only in 2014.
My path to transitioning, I suppose, began on the day of birth. I suppose it's a lifelong process, but of course that's a rather obtuse answer. There are moments and milestones, so the change of name and the undertaking of medical treatment. But of course the decision, or the aspiration at least, to transition, I can track back as early as I can remember. Only that I didn't know that there was such a thing as a transition until I began to see media pertaining to trans people, and then it took a little bit longer too before I could find medical assistance. And also in those days, it was quite a number of years ago, it was more complex and convoluted than today, with needing to see psychiatrists and go to multiple doctors. But in a very small nutshell, I would have changed my name 20 years ago now, and then started hormone therapy quite shortly thereafter, and I obtained chest surgery over a decade ago today. But now it's just a matter really of going to get the hormone shots every few months, and beyond that, the medical side of things is not really so much on my mind. Sometimes people ask when it's over or when I completed my transition, and I don't really see it that way. I see it as a constant state of flux throughout life, really, just part of growing and maturing.
But Stonewall had a significant change of approach in campaigning for trans people.
What Stonewall decided to do, for reasons which I've never understood and don't know, they decided that what they were going to do is do kind of a national campaign, if you like, and that was going to be around trans issues. Now, I don't particularly have any view on that. My argument with Stonewall has always been the way that Stonewall has always managed to do what it did so successfully was building broad alliances. So what you don't do is you don't go out saying trans women and women, and we have no debate about that. You are denying my existence if you disagree with me. So in 2014 or 15, a bunch of the original Stonewallers, there are about 40 people who were on the board for the first sort of 5 years or something like that. And we went round them and asked them whether they had anxieties that if Stonewall pursued the strategy of no debate, that it would divide the community, and what did they feel about that? And the vast majority of them said that they were worried about that. So we did eventually, and it was very hard work, we eventually got a meeting with Stonewall and said, look, we'd worried about this dividing the community, and actually we think you could, change your view. And they basically told us to, go to the Foreign Office, as my brother-in-law puts it. But actually, what have they achieved? Since 2014. Not only have they not built broad alliances around that, but actually if you look at the social attitudes survey, the figures have gone backwards rather than forward. And on any level, that's a failure.
As well as the addition of the light blue and pink for transgender, other colours started to be added to the flag in 2010 to represent various gender identities and groups. What does having a gender identity mean?
Gender identity came to be discussed by queer theorists in the 90s to works like Gender Trouble by Judith Butler, in which she talks about a certain performativity or constructed nature to gender. And so Judith Butler tells us that we adopt our gender anew each new day or every time we go out, and I think that that's a really fascinating concept. And so it came to be understood by queer theorists really in the third wave of feminism and in the beginning of queer theory that there would be more potential identities than those designated at birth, as we would say, as male, female, or intersex. So gendered identity doesn't necessarily have to be an academic concept, but I think we have to acknowledge that there is an academic foundation on which these concepts are laid.
So according to gender theory, it is your gender and only your gender that makes you male or female. So who people really are is defined by their gender. So identifying with your sex at birth, so that's the language I use. I'm going to put plenty of quotes because I never use that language. If you identify with the sex you were born in, you are cis. If you do not, you are then born in the wrong body and you are trans. If you do not identify with either the male or female sex, then you are non-binary.
But do we all have a gender identity?
I don't have one. Gender is a term used by feminists to basically talk about socially imposed roles and expectations based on people's sex. So what it is, it's a system created to maintain male supremacy in a patriarchy and female subordination. And what we're talking about here is masculinity. So all this set of behavior and expectation placed on male, which are, traits like strength or dominance, leadership, being independent, that then lead to expected role in society, such as breadwinners, rulers, warriors, protectors. And at the polar opposite of that, you've got femininity, so gender imposed on women, which is basically traits such as weakness, vulnerability, being pretty, so being visually pleasing, sexually pleasing for the male gaze, and existing for others, so being caring for others, being kind, being nice, putting others first, which then leads to jobs such as being a carer, being a housewife, never really being out there in the world. All these is gender expectations. And in clothing, it means that we're talking about clothes that are designed for women, that are restrictive, that are sexualizing, that are objectifying, where women feel constantly vulnerable and self-aware. And these are not just random expectation. They are polar opposite because they create that hierarchy. It means that under the traditional conservative version of gender, the power dynamic means that men rule over women. Women are then second-class citizens. Now, we as feminists do not accept these rules at all. We reject what we call sex stereotypes, what the ideologues call gender. We think that they are concepts. They do not exist in the real world. They are socially imposed.
So if what makes you a woman or a man is basically your internal feelings, does it follow that trans people are the gender of their choice? What does the law say about that?
The Gender Recognition Act was enacted in 2004. It came about as a result of a case which was taken to the European Court of Human Rights when a male transsexual was unable to marry as a woman because that person still had a male birth certificate, and also that they could be outed by somebody just going to the registrar of births and deaths and finding a copy of their birth certificate. And that was judged to be against the human rights of trans people. So the government brought about the Gender Recognition Act in 2004, which did two things. First of all, it allowed transsexuals to change their birth certificate to make it look as if they were the other sex. But also, and this is crucial, I don't think this is properly understood or recognised, it also allowed them to shroud that change in secrecy. So nobody was allowed to know. Trans people were actually put in the same situations as people under witness protection, where their former identity was kept secret. You may well argue now, after the Equality Act came in 2010, where we have protection against being discriminated against for being trans, and also equal marriage came about in 2014, so anybody can marry anybody of either sex, that the Gender Recognition Act is no longer necessary.
In order to change sex on their birth certificate and other legal documents, trans people need to obtain a gender recognition certificate. It requires them to live their acquired gender for 2 years and to have 2 medical reports. Many in the trans community complained it's cumbersome and dehumanizing, and Stonewall and other NGOs support them in their call for self-ID.
My thoughts on self-ID, of course, I'm very much for the concept of self-ID, and I think that I very much would have liked to enjoy that privilege, let's say, many years ago. So I'm all for it, but I also know that it's called into question now. For instance, here where I live in Germany, and of course beyond too. But I hope that common sense will prevail in that regard, and that we will allow people to have autonomy over their bodies and the decisions that they take pertaining to their bodies. But it's a very contentious theory or concept or development. And here in Germany, the incumbent chancellor has said he would like to see self-ID reversed to how it was until last year when a new German measure was passed. So I think in many countries at the moment, we're experiencing this tension. And I hope that we'll go in the right direction, let's put it like that, and allow for people to self-ID.
I don't have a gender recognition certificate, and I live quite happily as a transsexual person. So by my life, I think, well, is it really necessary? But what seems to me is that it's now almost seen as a license to be trans. So now I've got this gender recognition certificate, you must treat me as a woman, you must treat me as the opposite sex, and if you don't, then the law will deal with you. But that's never what it was designed for. And it leads to absurdities when people who look like their birth sex, sound like their birth sex, everybody can see through what they may or may not have done and see their birth sex. Suddenly, the law says they've got to treat them as the opposite sex. I think that's an absurdity. And it's going to lead to people being inherently disappointed because the law can't change the way that people think.
Indeed, in April 2025, the UK Supreme Court has ruled that the legal definition of a woman was based on biological sex. And that clarifies a portion of the Equality Act that unfortunately needed clarifying, that it took quite a few years to really get that ruling. So what the Equality Act say, and I'm going to read that because I don't want to get the wording wrong. It says that it prohibits discrimination on grounds of sex and gender reassignment, but it also allows for exemption, including for single-sex services and spaces, provided that such exemptions are proportionate and justifiable, for example, to ensure privacy, health, and safety. So what we see really is the Equality Act protects people from discrimination on the basis of sex, so being man or woman, on the basis of sexual orientation, which is important for us, and gender reassignment, whether somebody believes to be born in the wrong sex. And as it says, it allows exception, which means that for us, for women, for feminists, there is still an exemption that allows service providers to exclude men who identify as women with or without gender recognition certificate from women-only spaces if women ask for it, if women said that they were uncomfortable with men being there. And what we've seen really is trans activists using the fact that it was a little bit blurry and needed clarification to invade women-only spaces, to say, well, I have a gender recognition certificate, or simply I identify as a woman, therefore I have the right to be in those spaces. And so the question we were asking as feminists was this one: if women are protected under the characteristic of sex, but men can legally become women, is that protection still applying to women? Are they allowed to come in? Are they not allowed to come in? And this is something that we've been working actively against for about 10 years. And for lesbian and gay people, it's also crucially important, because if we can't define sex in the law, we can't define sexual orientation in the law. And if men can call themselves lesbian, if men can legally become women, sexual orientation means nothing. Same-sex attraction means nothing.
But how did single-sex spaces come about in the first place?
As a feminist, I have campaigned for and supported the rights of single-sex spaces in settings where women and girls might be vulnerable to male violence. Now, clearly, some of those settings are refuges and rape crisis centres, where the women and girls are going there because they've been harmed by men. But some settings are simply where sexual predators may decide provides them a good opportunity to commit acts of violence or harassment. And that would include changing rooms. It would include sports facilities, hospital wards. We know that women in prison are some of the most vulnerable in society. We know that because the majority of women are in prison as a result of male violence, directly or indirectly. So that's why I'm in favour of women-only, female-only spaces. But often the challenge is that you're concerned about men and male violence. Are you saying that trans women are all sexual predators? Well, first of all, trans women are men. And secondly, we never said all men are sexual violators, are sexual predators. But we still were able to argue in law and policy and societally that we should have those spaces. We understand and recognise that those that identify as transgender, that look different, that appear to be different, that they can face prejudice and abuse. What I'm sick and tired of hearing is that we should mop up that mess, is that we should have those men in our prisons. Male prisons shouldn't be friendly, welcoming places for trans-identified men. Of course not, because men will beat the shit out of them, harass and abuse them. Male prisons are very violent. So we have to, therefore, take the risk. But repeatedly over the years, I have said to trans people, on the odd occasion when one will speak in a debate kind of setting, look, feminists set up refuges and domestic violence services. We set up rape crisis centres. We did it without funding and we did it with volunteers. We will show you how to do it for yourselves. And then you can have trans-run domestic violence shelters for trans women, but you're not coming into our spaces.
Well, look, okay, so somebody who says self-ID and identifies as a woman, all right? Let me talk about the first days of coming out and affirming my gender, all right? Going out on the streets, dressed as a woman, all right? The fear, the aggression that people had towards me, first off, was intense. The idea that a man is going to dress as a woman and then walk into women's spaces to be inappropriate with women, I'd like to first see them actually go down the street and try to do that and dress as a woman first off to go through there. It's not going to happen. And half the time, most trans women are actually going to go and avoid going into spaces where we're even going to change clothes or be that way anyway. I know myself, when I go to a gym, I'm constantly covering shower stalls, covering the glass with towels if I'm changing my clothes to go, in and out of where I'm at.
The idea that a male rapist is going to go to all the effort and time to get a woman's dress, high heels, makeup and a wig, in order to then inveigle himself into a woman's toilet or a woman's space, that just doesn't make sense. Those tend to be hyper-masculinized men who value their masculinity, and appearing as a woman would be a terrible insult to their own selves. It's absolutely true that a tiny number of trans people have done bad things, but that is no excuse to generalize and penalize the whole trans community. That's what anti-Muslim bigots do. They say that because a small number of Muslims are terrorists, the whole Muslim community should suffer penalization. That is morally reprehensible about Muslims, and it's morally reprehensible to say similar things about trans people as well.
Some trans campaigners are indeed saying it is a violation of their human rights and plan to take the UK to the European Court of Human Rights.
But the thing is, you can't self-identify out of female genital mutilation. That is done to girls because they're girls. There's a series of things about women's lives, physically, biologically women's lives, that determine a whole set of things. There's a whole set of issues around health and health care, the way in which men and women differently experience heart issues, for instance, and so it goes on. So sex actually matters, and it's different from a notion of gender identity. When it comes to what we do about gender nonconformity, then there are a whole set of issues that are quite different in the sense that they're about social interaction. So I always think there's biology, there's law and policy, and there's social interaction. Biology, I don't think there's anybody credible who argues that as a species we're not binary. I went out years and years and years ago with somebody who was born with 1.5 legs. And he said to me the other day, he said, just because I've got 1.5 legs doesn't mean to say the human race is not bipedal. Of course there are exceptions, but the exceptions are from this norm. When it comes to law and policy, then we have to think about, take sport. There's never been a sex divide in equestrian sport because there isn't a provable muscular advantage for men in those sports. When it comes to rugby, frankly, if you put people who are biologically male on a pitch with people who are biologically female, one of those biological females will eventually die. There's a guy called Ross Tucker who is the sort of rugby type, expert on all of it. And he says, we're not in a contact sport, we're in a collision sport. So this is a basic matter of safety. And it feels to me silly, really silly to say, oh, no, this is about inclusion. Well, no, it's actually not. It's about risk assessment. It's about health and so on and so forth. So when it comes to policy, I just think we have to look at evidence and say to ourselves, what policy will protect women? And also, on the other hand, yes, if we want to say, well, trans people want access to sport. Let's think of the categories in which they can meaningfully compete.